Your conference is being recorded.
Hello, and welcome to the ABA section of Environment, Energy, and Resources podcast. Today's podcast is being co-sponsored by the Oil and Gas Committee and the Climate Change, Sustainable Development, and Ecosystems Committee. My name is Michael Cummings. I am an energy and environmental attorney in the Minneapolis office of the law firm of Frederickson and Byron. Today I'm very pleased to be moderating our program in my role as a vice chair on the Oil and Gas Committee and as a vice chair on the Climate Change Committee. The topic we'll be discussing today is one that I'm personally very excited and optimistic about, and that's the topic of carbon capture, use, and storage. And on that topic, I honestly could not think of two better guests to join us today to speak to that issue than the guests we have today. Very fortunate and happy to have Doug Scott from the Great Plains Institute and Stacey Dahl from Minnkota Power Cooperative joining us. So Doug and Stacey, thank you very much for being here.
Good to be here. Thanks.
By way of introduction, Doug Scott is Vice President for Electricity and Efficiency at the Great Plains Institute. In that role, Scott works on issues involving climate strategy and regulatory response, carbon capture, sequestration, and usage, and issues involving the changing utility business model. Before joining GPI in February of 2015, Scott served as chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission, and prior to that as director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. Scott's public service also includes a term as mayor of Rockford, Illinois, 3 terms as Illinois state representative, and 10 years as attorney for the City of Rockford Legal Department. Scott earned a BA with honors from the University of Tulsa and a JD with honors from Marquette University. Stacey Dahl is Senior Manager of External Affairs for Minnkota Power Cooperative, based in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Originally from Bismarck, North Dakota, Stacey Dahl received her undergraduate degree in education in 2004 from the University of North Dakota, and she received her Juris Doctor degree in 2008 from the University of North Dakota School of Law. Dahl served in the North Dakota House of Representatives from 2005 until 2012. An attorney, she is also a former private practitioner and prosecutor. In addition to overseeing public policy efforts for Minnkota, Dahl serves on the leadership team exploring the feasibility of Project Tundra, a proposed carbon capture project at the coal-fired Young Station in center North Dakota. She lives in Grand Forks with her husband and 2 children. So Doug and Stacey, again, thanks very much for being here. I think turning to our topic at hand, carbon capture, use, and storage, I'll start it off saying this from someone that's been working in energy for over 10 years now, both in the environmental consulting and in the practice of law. And even when I talk to my colleagues, friends, and clients that have been working in the energy industry, it's not uncommon to get a response of they're not really sure what I'm talking about when I'm talking about carbon capture and why I'm so excited about it. And I think it's quite likely that many of our listeners are in the same boat. They've maybe heard a little bit about carbon capture, but they're not really familiar with what it means, or they might not know what it means at all. So, Doug, I'm hoping you might be able to provide just kind of a high-level general overview primer of what is carbon capture, what are we talking about, where are they capturing carbon from, what are they doing with it, why is this a good thing?
Sure. Well, thanks, Michael. It's great to be with you and Stacey on the program today. Carbon capture is actually a technology that's been around since the early 1970s. It's used in a variety of industrial and power processes. It's used for a variety of purposes, including things like enhanced oil recovery and in a lot of industrial processes. A lot of them need carbon, CO2, to be able to run their particular manufacturing process. So the idea of getting carbon from somewhere and using it or storing it is something that's been around for almost half a century now. Most of the time we talk about carbon capture these days, we're talking about capturing it from power plants, given or from industrial processes, and given what we're facing from the climate challenge, the idea that trying to take something that is contributing to climate change and to be able to either use it or store it safely is something that has a lot of appeal. So when you're talking about it from power plants, you're generally talking about something where you either add some equipment onto the power plant to capture it from the smokestack, or from an industrial process to do that as well. Or there are some new technologies that are out there that will utilize different industrial processes to try to capture the carbon, up to and including something that's getting a lot of attention now, which is something called direct air capture, where you're actually just taking carbon directly out of the atmosphere and then creating a stream of pure CO2 that you can either utilize in an industrial process or that you can safely store underground. And all of that, if we listen to the climate science that's out there and understand that larger and larger amounts of carbon in the atmosphere may create an issue for all of us, figuring out a way to either utilize or store that carbon safely becomes very important.
Excellent, Doug. And thank you very much. And I think you touched on this in your prior response, but maybe just to build on it a little bit. What kind of industries are you seeing as the biggest players today in carbon capture, or what might be the biggest players down the road? And like you mentioned, those of us working in the energy industry, almost every day you'll see something about the action to decarbonize the electric industry and reduce
Sure.
carbon emissions. And a lot of times in those conversations, my personal experience has been sometimes, carbon, for better or for worse, gets painted as the bad actor. And when I've been in carbon capture circles, sometimes the tone of that conversation is a little bit different. And the question, as I've understood it being asked there, is, is it fair to consider carbon a resource? Does it have value? Is it something that we can, capture and put to beneficial use? So kind of on that point, what do you see as the main players today or tomorrow in being able to capture carbon from the sources and perhaps put it to beneficial use, put it to something good?
Sure. So in terms of where the sources are, where a lot of carbon is coming from, power generation, specifically from fossil fuel plants, so from gas plants, from coal-fired power plants. That's traditionally where you hear a lot of the discussion around carbon, but it's also generated in several industrial processes, whether that's in cement making, steel production, a lot of chemical processes that not only generate CO2 but also use it in their manufacturing process. And so a lot of industries for years have been paying to try to get CO2 from naturally occurring sources. And only in the last several years have we actively been thinking about it in terms of, well, if this is a commodity that's necessary for a lot of industries, can we utilize that? Can we in essence take care of two things at once? Can we capture it from the power plants or from industrial processes and then get it to the people that need it in their own process? One of the major places where it's been used over the last 40-something years is in enhanced oil recovery. In other words, where in existing oil fields, there's some of the oil that's very hard to get at. Injecting carbon into those fields will allow the oil to flow a little bit more smoothly, being able to get at some of that oil that otherwise wouldn't be able to be reached, and then a large percentage of the carbon stays underground at that point, which is great from an environmental standpoint. But if you're running the oil field, you're going to need more and more of that carbon resource, which is why in a lot of cases you're seeing some of the carbon capture technology located very close to existing oil fields or within distance where they can pipeline it to the existing oil fields, and thereby the oil fields being able to utilize that resource. So it's not just there, but as I said, in a lot of industries, there's a need for carbon, and so part of the goal of folks that are working in this industry is to try to figure out how to match the sources of carbon to the places where that's either needed or to where it can be stored safely underground in certain geologic formations throughout the country.
All right, perfect, Doug. Thank you. I think on that note of, it'd be a perfect opportunity to turn it over to Stacy, and we're very fortunate to have Stacy from Minnkota here, and fortunately, again, in our very own backyard, from my view, they have one of the most exciting, if not the most exciting, carbon capture project or proposed carbon capture project in the U.S. right now, Project Tundra. So, Stacy, I'll turn it over to you. If you could tell us exactly what Project Tundra is, that would be outstanding.
Thank you, and I agree that it is very exciting. We've been working on this project for a few years, probably about 4 years, but things have really accelerated in the last year or so with some policy developments and some additional staffing we've brought onto the team. So this project really is continues to progress forward in a very good way. But essentially, Minnkota is spearheading Project Tundra, which is a project proposed to capture CO2 emissions from our largest existing coal-fired unit, which is Unit 2 out at the Milton R. Young Station. That's located in central North Dakota. And if developed and constructed, would capture up to 90% of the CO2 from that unit and would be, at that point, the largest carbon capture project in the world. The CO2 from that capture technology would be sent to permanent geologic storage, and with the potential, as Doug referenced, of using that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery in the future. We have really unique geology in North Dakota, both on the permanent geologic sequestration front. We have very stable geology, so there's not worry about induced seismicity. But we also have proximity to conventional oil fields where the CO2 eventually could be used for enhanced oil recovery. And North Dakota is taking some small steps towards enhanced oil recovery with CO2, but we're certainly not as far along as places like Texas today. But this project builds upon prior federal investment in the Petronova project, which was a really important clean coal project. It was on time and on budget, which was very exciting, and it uses an amine-based technology, which is what we are proposing to use in this case. So we know that there is an important application that works on coal. Our project is distinguished from Petronova in that we're looking again at permanent geologic storage, whereas Petronova uses their CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And then in addition to that, if you've ever been to North Dakota, you know that our cold weather climate is certainly a challenge. And we also use a low-rank coal, which has its challenges, and so it's different from other coal types in the country. So we're doing a lot of research and development to make sure this amine technology works on lignite. So it's, again, if constructed, it would be the largest project in the world, and for that reason, it's a very exciting process and project. And so I mentioned that we have been working on the feasibility phases and some of our initial engineering, and so now we're moving into the next phase where we're looking at that actual feed step, which stands for the front-end engineering design. And so that's really the study you undertake right before you construct. And so we're in a very good position at this point, but there's still some work left to do before we make that final determination as to whether to construct or not construct. What is really driving this project at this point, and is a very welcome change, is this 45Q tax reform that passed last year with really bipartisan support at the federal level. And I know Doug is going to get into the specifics of that, but that really is a tool and a policy that I believe is ultimately going to help construct projects like Tundra and other projects around the country.
Great, Stacy. Thank you very much. That again, very exciting project, and congratulations to your team on your successes so far in the development, and I certainly wish you the best of luck as your project moves forward with its continued feasibility study and development. So again, thank you, and best of luck with your project.
Thank you.
And Doug, we talked about Project Tundra, and Stacy touched upon the similar project Petronova in Texas. I know you have your finger probably on the pulse of what's going on there as well as anybody. What else are you seeing out there for exciting or large-scale projects, or even not large-scale, just exciting or new projects in the carbon capture space?
Well, I think a couple of them, and Stacey's exactly right. I think the tax credit changes that happened in 2018 at the federal level have really started to help drive some new projects. And I'll just mention a couple of them that we're seeing. Both are partnerships involving Occidental Petroleum, who's been a leader in this area on the EOR side of the ledger, but now they're partnering with White Energy to capture carbon from an ethanol plant, and they also have a project with Carbon Engineering to do direct air capture that we talked about a little bit a while ago, that will capture about 500,000 tons a year of carbon directly from the atmosphere. So, those are a couple of newer projects that are pretty exciting, and I think are driven in part not just by companies who are looking to make a real impact from the climate side, but also because the economics of it with the changes in the tax code or make these kinds of projects more favorable now, as Stacy said.
Right, great. So, yeah, both you and Stacy mentioned the 45Q tax credit. If you wouldn't mind, just provide a high-level overview of, what is the 45Q tax credit, and related, is there any other legislation that might have, a similar importance in advancing this industry that's either on the horizon or that you're aware of that, might be introduced as well?
Sure. So 45Q is the numerical section of the tax code where you find credits for carbon capture. Those were recently increased in legislation last year, which really did three things that really helped a lot. One is increase the amount of the tax credit to $50 a ton for every ton that's stored underground, and $35 a ton for every ton that's utilized in another procedure. The thought being you get the lesser amount because you're also getting paid for the resource, as we talked about earlier, getting paid for that carbon. So that was one major change. The second major change was that it lowered the threshold in order to be eligible to receive the credit. It used to be that you had to generate 500,000 tons a year of carbon. That was lowered to 100,000 tons a year, which really brought ethanol plants into play. And that's a major development because, a lot of ethanol plants located where they are in the middle of the country either have the ability to pipeline to existing oil fields, to use in manufacturing processes, or, as Stacy mentioned, some of the geology that's available to be able to store that material underground. So I think there are going to be some pretty exciting things in terms of ethanol coming up. And then the other thing that it did, that the tax law changed, was to make the tax credit so that the whoever is actually recovering the material will get the benefit of the credit, and that will allow some partnerships with companies, because a lot of times, depending on what the ownership is of the plant itself, there may not be any tax appetite at all. So the tax credit only helps you out if you've got a tax bill to pay, and by allowing, in essence, kind of a transferability of that, it'll allow for some other folks to make deals and get in and do some projects that otherwise may not have been able to take advantage of the tax credit. In addition to that, now there's something called the Use It Act that has been introduced. That's going to help with pipeline and other infrastructure to support the carbon capture industry. And then some other changes that can be done on things like private activity bonds to make these kinds of projects eligible for private activity bonds, which will allow companies to borrow money at a much reduced interest rate. In essence, that's what it does. And again, Stacy, exactly right. All of this legislation, from 45Q changes to the new ones I just mentioned, all have wonderful bipartisan support in a day and age where we don't see a lot of wonderful bipartisan support for much of anything. It's really kind of encouraging to see that. So I think there's some very positive momentum here, and I think we'll see some additional legislation to help the industry going forward.
That's great. Thank you, Doug. And I know you and others at GPI have been very active proponents of on the policy front for this. So congratulations, definitely, for the successes you've had so far.
Thank you.
And again, I wish you nothing but the best as you guys continue to push forward on these issues.
Thank you.
I think we're getting close to the end of our slot for recording time, but just open it up to either of you if you have any closing comments on what do you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges to scaling up these projects, to seeing more Petronovas, to seeing more Tundras, to seeing more direct air captures. What is it going to take to get there? We're almost there. Kind of what are the big opportunities and constraints in your views?
Well, I'll start. Stacey, jump in. But as I said, I think there's some great momentum here. You've got people like Senator Alexander calling for kind of a Manhattan project on future energy sources. So that's the kind of thing where carbon capture can really play a role. If you look at both the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency, their numbers trying to mitigate the impact of climate change, they both cite carbon capture as something that's going to be necessary going forward. And I think the other, the good thing is that as more projects get done, as Project Tundra, happens, and Petronova happens, and the other projects that we mentioned, just like with other technologies, as more projects get done, the costs come down. And that makes the economics, which to date have been the biggest challenge, that makes it more feasible, as well as, things like the legislation can help. And there are some great blueprints out there, both for federal policy and things states can do. We'd be happy to get anybody that information if they're interested in that.
And I'll just add that, the high level policy drivers have been put in place, and that's very important. The next important step is going to be implementation through the regulatory process. And there's a lot of different entities that touch a CO2 capture project. There's state regulatory entities, and there are lots of federal agencies involved as well. So these are very, very complex projects with a lot of oversight and regulation. And so to streamline that process will be very important to the development of these projects.
All right, great. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Doug, again so much for joining us today. It's been a great call, and I know you're both very busy, so thanks again so much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us. And again, this program has been sponsored by the ABA section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. You can find out more about our section, including how to join, at our website, www.americanbar.org/environ, or if you have any troubles, feel free to reach out to me personally, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the ABA section and help you get joined if you would be interested. Again, my name is Michael Cummings, and thanks for listening to this ABA podcast.